Welcome to Mandates and Megaphones, hosted by Jeremy Maggs, unpacking the politics, promises and power plays behind the G20 summit.
Hello and welcome to Mandates and Megaphones. It's the podcast here on Moneyweb that goes beyond G20 summit statements and into the rooms, I hope, where power eventually meets purpose. I'm Jeremy Maggs, and the conversation in association with Standard Bank. Now, this year's G20 Labour and Employment Ministers meeting, organised Labour arrived with a clear message. Technology must serve people and not replace them. We're going to talk about that. But the conversation was obviously a lot bigger than just artificial intelligence. Labour leaders from across the world, including South Africa, pushing for enforceable rights in a shifting global economy, from decent work in digital platforms to protections in climate transitions and a stronger voice. And this is probably the most important aspect, a stronger voice in how the global economy is governed. What was their rallying cry? Well, a new global deal for workers, one that recognises dignity, inclusion and fairness as non-negotiables. These are big, lofty ideas. Joining me today are two leaders who carry that message, I think, from the shop floor to the summit. First is Tanya van Mielis, who is Head of Policy at COSATU, along with Rifta Adjam, who is General Secretary of FEDUSA, that's the Federation of Unions of South Africa. And I'm hoping in the next 20 minutes or so we can explore how Labour is confronting power, platforms and policy, and why they might believe this G20 moment that is looming in November matters more than ever before. So to both of you, a very warm welcome. And maybe, Tanya, to you first of all, simply because you're sitting in front of me and you're not the end of a telephone, let's start with the G20 agenda and Labour's bigger voice. And what, in your opinion, are the top priorities that Labour movements around the world should be bringing to the summit at the end of the year?
So the top priorities firstly relate to workers on the shop floor. So are more jobs being created? As an example, are more women entering the workforce? Are workers being protected with developments from AI? But workers can't just look at the shop floor, because we know that global developments impact us as well. So the broader engagements are around, for example, tax justice. How do we tax the super wealthy? Around debt, what happens to developing countries in debt? So there's a much wider agenda, and Labour is inserting its voice to ensure that we impact the wider agenda beyond shop floor issues.
The challenge, of course, will be to see how that voice is received and whether you're listened to, and we can pick that up in just a moment. But Rifta, do you want to add anything to that? What do you see as the priorities?
Well, Tanya's articulated that quite well, Jeremy, and from where I sit, we have been holding hands throughout this particular process. We certainly want to reiterate the fact that we have entered this particular conversation on a front where the world faces a complexity and a plethora of challenges. I don't want to say problems, but in essence, emergencies. We are dealing with those issues as we approach the conversation. So as the L20, our role was there not only to influence the conversations, but to ensure that the decency of the work that we are faced with on the shop floor remains one that is at the hearts and minds of everyone that we represent. So ultimately what we are looking for, in addition to what Tanya has highlighted, is a new trade model. A trade model that not only defends labour rights, but at the same time respects national sovereignty. We have seen the shocks, we have heard what the global north have had to say, but ultimately, as Tanya has highlighted, there are wealth taxes, there are financial transaction taxes, and at the same time, we cannot forget the absence or the critical importance of the investments in the just transition strategies. It must lie at the heart of industrial policy with the intent not only to create decent jobs, but ultimately, number one, stronger social protection for informal and platform workers that has been at the heart of these discussions. And we must see that global solidarity on human rights is also at the core of these conversations. So gender was high on the agenda, decent work, the just transitions, not just speaking from a perspective of climate change, but ultimately also artificial intelligence and how that ultimately is not only replacing certain tasks, but reconfiguring workplace control. So hard decisions and tough decisions and conversations were had, but we believe that we are on the right path in order to push the envelope.
Tanya, Rifta used the word decent work or decency in work on 3 or 4 occasions. Do you think the G20 can do enough to tackle rising global inequality through the lens of decent work?
So, in words, they say they're promoting it. But I sat there listening to countries where I know they do not recognise trade unions, where I know there's violent repression of strikes. So for me, there's a hypocrisy in some of the G20 countries. We can work on the statements as much as we like and get stuff out, but at the end of the day, those countries have to implement. Now, that doesn't mean we shouldn't engage in the G20. Of course we should engage. But the key is to make sure that we get agreements that can be implemented, that we can monitor, that we can push for on the shop floor, and that we can then hold countries accountable in terms of implementation.
So what, in your opinion, Tanya, would be an agreement that might shift the needle for working people?
So one of the agreements that was reached now in the Employment Working Group is decreasing rates of NEET. So it's not in employment or education. Many youngsters are out of that, and they've agreed now to lower the existing target by a further 5%. That's positive because part of what contributes to poverty and inequality is high levels of unemployment, and whatever we can do to make sure that more people enter the labour force, the better chance we have of addressing poverty and inequality.
Rifta, I'd be interested to hear what you think would move the needle, but before that, maybe give me your sense of what decent work actually means.
Well, let's take a look at it from the lens of platform workers and the gig economy as a critical example of what we are confronted with at this stage. And I reiterate the essence of indecency that we are experiencing at this stage. So, Jeremy, when we look at that example that I'm going to cite now, we speak about the fact that labour is not just a commodity. Our blood, sweat and tears have built many economies, but at the same time, we are not being extended the fruits of those labour that we have built these economies on. So ultimately, when we look at what is happening right now, it is the fact that capital is driving certain engagements and transitions with a view that they are literally eroding all forms, number one, of social protection, all forms of benefits, and all forms of guarantees that there will be permanency, that there will be opportunities for occupational health and safety. So we cannot stand back and accept the fact that these workers are not just marginalized, not just engaging in the informal economy, but that they are being exploited at all levels. So we need to limit the amount of informality that is happening, and we need to have these conversations to ensure that there can be greater levels of investment in skills in a demand-led industrial strategy, but to ensure that the lived experiences and the realities that these platform workers and many workers in the informal economy can be eliminated, to ensure that social justice can prevail and that the decency that we speak about can become a reality. So no social protection, no extension of guarantees in the workplace. It ultimately becomes a question of redirecting what job security is about, and that is what we are fighting. So that is ultimately the major point that we are emphasizing here, to ensure that there can be solidarity in all places, not just in South Africa and our neighbors, but on the continent and globally.
And Tanya, make no mistake, it is a fight, because it's becoming increasingly more difficult to halt the march of rampant capital, as Rifta has referred to.
Absolutely, but I think it's not rampant capital necessarily that is the core problem. It's rampant neoliberal capital. So if you had to look at where neoliberalism is running rife compared to the established social democracies, workers experience very different conditions. The ILO defines decent work as having 4 elements. It's employment, it's social protection, it's addressing workers' rights, and it's social dialogue. In 80% of countries surveyed by the International Trade Union Confederation, 80% of countries don't recognise trade unions, don't allow the right to strike, don't allow collective bargaining. You can't have any basis for decent work if that's not allowed. If one's then looking at rampant capitalism, that is rampant capitalism. It's a capitalism that is saying they're not prepared to be subject to any form of rules or regulation, and that they want to be able to continue to exploit and move at will in order to maximize profits. That cannot be. That's not sustainable in the long term for everybody.
Rifta, I'm interested to know what you talk about having made some progress in the initial meetings, but I can't help but wonder, as you both list the challenges, the problems, the difficulties that lie ahead, whether Labour has any real influence in G20 decision making. Or is there a concern that this might just be symbolic participation, that you won't achieve what you actually set out to do?
No, that is a myth that we must dispel, Jeremy. We have made progress, although the progress is not at the levels of speed that we would like to see. We must acknowledge the fact now that the principle of an injury to one is an injury to all has been resonating in the L20 platform, which has expanded into the Employment Working Group, as Tanya has rightfully highlighted. So some of these turbulences that are being felt up north is not just happening in isolation or in a vacuum. So ultimately, when we have the trade unions, for example, from the AFL-CIO, the biggest federations in the United States, coming down to South Africa and ultimately saying to us that forms of collective bargaining that have long been held dear and hard-won fights have been rubbished at the stroke of a pen, it means that we now understand the hardships that are felt on one level that has a ripple effect everywhere. So that social solidarity and the global solidarity must begin to speak at all levels. We need to move beyond just talking, as many of us are saying, and the adoption of measurable targets for wage growth and labour share of GDP and universal social protection is what we have been engaging in. So, Jeremy, there have been tremendous progress from our side as Labour, because we stand united, not just in terms of unemployment, not just in terms of inequality, but ultimately in terms of sustainability, because we are seeing climate shocks, we are seeing artificial intelligence, so the job guarantees, the retraining and the cost of inaction is what we have all spoken to dearly, and many of us are speaking from the same hymn sheet. So I believe there has been influence, there has been engagements and discussions, because ultimately, if we are not going to step up to the occasion, nothing is going to happen. I guarantee you, and Tanya will confirm this, that we are all standing in unity, in solidarity, as the theme for the L20 and the G20 has spoken to. We cannot afford to be divided when capital finds new ways of enhancing profit share.
Tanya, what about unions in the rest of Africa?
So we had made through this year, as the 4 federations in South Africa, a concerted effort to bring the unions from other countries in Africa on board as well. We held specific workshops, 2 leading up to this final Employment Working Group, which we made sure unions from Africa could access. It was hybrid. In the final workshop, we helped raise funding to make sure that unions from Africa were there. Unions from Africa including ourselves, had put forward a letter to President Ramaphosa identifying our core demands, and in setting up the agenda in the L20 summit and what we were going to push to the Employment Working Group, we made sure that workers and unions from Africa were heard and our concerns were articulated.
Here on Moneyweb, you're listening to Mandates and Megaphones, another G20 special, and today Labour and the G20. I'm in conversation with Tanya van Mielis, who is Head of Policy at COSATU, along with Rifta Ajam, who is General Secretary of FEDUSA, that's the Federation of Unions of South Africa. So, Tanya, let's talk about artificial intelligence now, technology and worker protection. It is important. Both of you have mentioned that it was raised in pre-conversation. To what extent are labour unions and workers part of AI policy conversations, or is there a concern that decisions are being made without your constituency?
There is a concern that decisions are being made without us, especially not only at a policy level where there is some discussion, but at the factory floor. So companies would go ahead in many cases and implement new control regimes using AI and then discipline workers on that basis. And we haven't been part of that conversation. So where workers are impacted on the ground in their everyday life, how they're given instructions, how they're monitored, how they're disciplined, there's generally a gap between unions being able to engage management on that compared to the policy level.
So it's not an argument about the march of artificial intelligence, it's just about being incorporated into the conversation and seeking a degree of protectionism.
Artificial intelligence is marching on for all of us, whether we like it or not. I mean, we can't become modern-day Luddites. The question is to make sure that we are aware of the potential positive impacts and make sure we harness them as unions, but also the potential negative impacts, and then have serious discussions both with policymakers and managers about how to mitigate those negative impacts.
So, Rifta, how do you get a foot in the door as far as that debate is concerned?
It's not very difficult, Jeremy, to engage on that conversation. As Tanya said, it is marching along, but at the same time, unions must hold dear the batons that they carry. We have representation, we have recognition within the workplaces, and what becomes a fundamental process now, which FEDUSA has already affirmed in many of our own collective bargaining agreements, is the fact that we should not engage it. It should be a demand. It should be a cornerstone in what we see as a revolution and as a transition. We believe that if there is no notion of upskilling, of reskilling, and looking and identifying what the new jobs and roles of the future are going to be in terms of AI, then we are certainly going to be left behind. As you referenced that the process already marching on, we have to acknowledge that artificial intelligence is not only replacing certain tasks, it's ultimately reconfiguring workplace control. And when I say that, I mean that algorithms are making decisions that were once held by humans, especially in terms of recruitment, scheduling, and even performance monitoring and termination. So we need to make sure that the shifts of power are moved or are used in such a way that it engages and it is a collaborative effort where workers and even managers are able to re-centralize the systems that have once now been owned by them, but are now moving further and further away to tech firms. Because what we are seeing, Jeremy, is ultimately risk, and more risk in terms of not only adherence to workplace policies, but ultimately labour laws and systems. And we must guard against that because it comes back to the loss of autonomy, the loss of our voices in the labour market, but more especially so the dignity and work. So as FEDUSA, what we are saying, and I believe that all the federations are speaking the same language when it comes to this particular rights-based framework, when we speak about accountability, especially in terms of algorithms, there must be transparency. there must be worker consultation and negotiation, and we must appeal for mechanisms for data protection rights. But what we are not going to negotiate on is collective bargaining provisions over technological change. We believe that a digital future that does not embed fairness will only deepen existing inequalities. And as South Africa, we have a reputation that we need to start polishing.
So, Tanya, you might all be on the same page as far as this argument is concerned, as Rifta has pointed out. But are unions thinking assertively enough in rethinking their tools for regulating and managing technology? Do you believe that you've got the answers?
It's a work in progress. What we're drawing on case studies from around the world where trade unions and workers have been highly proactive. And I'm going to give you one or two examples. In one case in South Korea, a bank had outsourced to a call center, and then they decided to start retrenching call center workers. What the union then said was, why are the retrenchments taking place? What they found was that people using the bank started dropping the second the bank started using chatbots instead of workers. When that was identified, they were able to make sure that those workers weren't retrenched, and those who had been retrenched were reinstated. Another example is, for example, in the Chinese trade unions. We met with them recently. They gave us numerous examples of how they're using AI themselves to advance workers' interests. So, for example, they've set up a job matching system where 3.3 million employers had posted jobs that were available to workers. And I think at the point when we spoke, 1.3 million had already been taken up within a matter of 2 weeks. So we can use the technology. The challenge for us is to be able to identify where we need to use the technology and how best we use it. In order to do that, we have to get some skills ourselves.
And Rifta, if you don't do that, essentially AI is just going to widen inequality and will entrench exclusion, I imagine.
You are absolutely spot on, Jeremy. We need to be able to look at co-created solutions to be able to advance on these matters. There are industries that can use AI as a complementary factor, and I also want to point to the example. There was a roundtable discussion where Commissioner Kieswetter from SARS was engaging in the conversation and enhancing the topic about how chatbots and AI are actually speeding up the payments towards taxpayers in terms of their returns when it comes to the annual processes. That is one good example. But the important emphasis that we are saying here now is that we need employers to invest in technology in such a way that it not only just enhances skills, the capabilities of the workforce at this stage, but when we look at production, it should be a shared value at the end of the day. We not only sit with the youth unemployment that will be spiraling, but we are also seeing that decent work deficits will ultimately increase. From our perspective, the emphasis on training, retraining, and investing in the technology will only benefit everyone as long as we have shared conversations on the matter. So ultimately, we are in full support of a national jobs guarantee, but public retraining programs and also social dialogue frameworks for all sectors undergoing technological or even ecological change, speaking about the green transition, is so important for us. And as they say, leave no one behind in this instance to ensure that the transitions are fair in all respects. Technology can work, but as we always say in the trade union movement, we become clever when we use the technology, but at the end of the day, if you go into a disciplinary hearing, then Professor Google will not be your best friend. It's important for us to look at those collaborative initiatives and co-creating strategies. It's possible if we learn to start trusting one another in the abilities of what we can achieve, all in the interest of South Africa, firstly.
To both of you, as we start to bring this conversation to a close, I just want to pivot and look at wages, equity and economic justice very quickly. And Tanya, the role that Labour has to play in shaping, and you alluded to it at the start of this conversation, in trade agreements and fair tax policy. What's on the table?
So certainly what COSATU and Labour is pushing more broadly is that we impose a tax on the super wealthy. So if we look, for example, at South Africa, where we have an austerity budget, we desperately need new sources of funds. For us, it's only just to be taxing the wealthy, the super wealthy, in order to get more money to ensure that we have education and healthcare and the services that government is supposed to provide. Underlying decent work as well and decent wages is the ability to be able to pay them. So if we're looking at trade regimes, for example, we have to ensure that we're able to access markets productively, that we're able to produce value-added goods, which are generally, if you look at, for example, at an auto worker, more or better paid than low-value jobs. And those agreements are essential to create jobs, but then at the same time, we need to be able to protect jobs. So we need to be able to use not only the trade agreements, but also the trade tools, such as safeguard measures, anti-dumping measures, raising tariffs where we still have space to do so in order to protect jobs here.
Rifta, maybe pick up on that if you want to, but maybe just add the trade dynamic to that as well, given that as we have this conversation, we are in the middle of a trade tariff maelstrom at the moment.
Absolutely. Jeremy, one of the conversations that was had was the advancement of the ACFTA, the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement. We should be looking towards this as an opportunity not only to diversify our markets, but to ensure that South Africa, as the lead economy on the continent, is able to drive reindustrialization. We need to start opening up markets. We need to ensure that these turbulent times that we have been facing and continue to face is one that can limit those shocks onto the market. We need to ultimately ensure that we look at reinvesting. We need to make sure that the capabilities that exist, not just in the private sector as those manufacturing hubs, but to ensure that we can open up these trade areas for us as a continent, because we remain the lead driver. A key aspect that we highlighted, Jeremy, at the L20 and equally so in the further discussions is the fact that South Africa is an exporter of commodities, ultimately wealth, but we import poverty, because we have to buy the finished products, and we have to change that dynamic in such a way that it brings back social justice and it gives forward, or it plays forward, the rules of engagement in terms of shared prosperity. So as I close on that particular question, I wanted to zoom in on that one specifically, but I want to say that beyond these transformations that we are observing in the world of work, trade unions are definitely repositioning ourselves. We are moving beyond collective bargaining only when our voices in many instances are being amplified by the media. We are here to serve as knowledge hubs. We are here to be active training facilitators. We are here to actively influence policy, and we will remain guardians of workplace justice. So we are certainly repositioning ourselves to engage and to ensure that our members are actively informed about what is happening, not just in South Africa, but around us when many of these aspects are at play. So South Africa most certainly repositioning itself on the continent to continue to advance, because we have the geographic benefit and the location, so we need to play it forward. But once again, it is about co-creating strategies, about redefining trust and ensuring that we can advance the ambitions of what we want to do. We cannot accept that it is business as usual, where the stubbornly high levels of unemployment only just exacerbates the inequalities that we are seeing.
And that is where we're going to leave it for this edition of Mandates and Megaphones, brought to you in association with Standard Bank. Now, let me try and sum this up very quickly. I think today's conversation has made it very clear that the future of work isn't just about technology. It's also, as my two guests outlined, about purpose. It's about power and protection. And while AI may be rewriting the rules, it's patently clear to me that Labour still has a voice, an important one, at forums like the G20. But that voice has got to be louder, it's got to be bolder, and maybe more coordinated than ever before. So my thanks to Tanya van Mielis, Head of Policy at COSATU, and Rifta Ajam, General Secretary of FEDUSA. I'm Jeremy Maggs. Thank you for listening.
Thank you for listening to Mandates and Megaphones. You can find more episodes on moneyweb.co.za.